For as long as I can remember, there has always been a sense of mystery surrounding my family's Lincoln collection. Abraham Lincoln was the most photographed American of the 19th century. But by the 20th century, many of his portraits were scattered, lost, in some cases forgotten. They are the images that show Lincoln as we know him today. And all of them, in one form or another, ended up in my family's attic. It's a story that starts on the bloodiest day of the Civil War, at a fence where a wounded Union soldier crawled out from among the dead. His name was William Meserve. Lincoln came to the battlefield and thanked him and his fellow soldiers for their bravery. A generation later, that soldier's son, Frederick Meserve, began to hunt down all the photographs of Lincoln and the Civil War. His search turned into a lifelong obsession.
If it weren't for our guest tonight, many of the Lincoln photographs would have been lost. I want you to meet Mr. Frederick Hill Meserve, foremost collector of Lincoln photographs in the world.
Meserve shaped the way we see Lincoln today. He helped pick the image to go on the penny. He provided the picture to go on the $5 bill. His photographs were used to carve Mount Rushmore. And he worked with the sculptor of the Lincoln Memorial. In a way, he helped engrave Lincoln's face in America's memory. Frederick Meserve was my great-grandfather. I knew him when I was a boy. That's me being held by my father. Always working at Meserve's side was his daughter Dorothy, my grandmother. He collected photographs. She collected memories. And for much of the 20th century, they worked together on Lincoln. Dorothy Meserve Kuhnhart was also an author of children's books. She once said, "I can tune into children. What makes them laugh makes me laugh." She is best remembered for her book, Pat the Bunny. It was the original interactive book for babies. I remember my grandmother was always fun to be around. She hid the fact that she was haunted by depression, obsessions, and a constant fear of failure. All her life she was driven by a desire to please her father. She worked so hard, she squeezed 2 lives into 1. She fought her demons by writing for children, but she spent most of her life trying to understand Lincoln. Dorothy's curiosity and a manic style of research allowed her to know the personal side of his story as few others had. One scholar said, "She knows more about the Lincoln family than anyone alive." For more than a century, Lincoln has taken up most of our family's living space and defined all of our lives. As a filmmaker, I'm working with 2 of my sons to piece together our Lincoln story before it vanishes in time. We're using the words and research of 6 generations of my family, taken from letters, diaries, and manuscripts, and from the family memoirs my father wrote. We're pulling together old photographs and home movies. Like my father before me, we've been taught to hold on to things. I lived with my grandmother one hot summer towards the end of her life. She lay in bed as I helped her pack up box after box of her research.
Lincoln is like a drug. I couldn't stop digging. One day, whoever goes through all my papers will see I've lived a life of unfinished things. My father once told me that anyone who studies Lincoln is never alone. He was a modest New York businessman by day and a collector the rest of the time.
One doesn't know at the beginning of an adventure how it will turn out. I got started because of my father, William Meserve. He fought in the Civil War and kept a diary of everything he saw or felt. As he grew older, I searched for photographs to illustrate his war experience.
After the diary project, Frederick Meserve was hooked on collecting. In addition to war scenes, he compiled photographs of every officer in the Union Army and all but 3 of the Confederates. Then he went after portraits of every prominent person from the Civil War era. He surrounded himself with more than 100,000 images.
Father collected so many photographs that our home was overflowing. The boxes that filled his workroom were the result of his early detective work. In 1903, he tracked down the lost glass negatives of the Civil War photographer Matthew Brady. He discovered more than 10,000 images in a New Jersey warehouse.
I bought them all after I picked up one negative and held it to the light. It was the face of Abraham Lincoln.
From that point forward, Father spent the rest of his life studying Lincoln. He became known as the man who knew Lincoln's face, the world authority.
My great-grandfather's first publication was 100 photographs of Abraham Lincoln. He gave each a number with an M for Meserve. Whenever he determined an image was not Lincoln, he labeled it spurious and gave it to Dorothy. He asked her to start her own collection of fake Lincolns. Later, he said it was his way to make her feel part of his work. My grandmother began writing about Lincoln when she was just 8. I think she must have been trying to please her father.
I find such comfort being with him in his world of Lincoln.
In 1915, Fred Meserve took her to see a film, The Birth of a Nation. Dorothy later said that the scene of Lincoln's assassination was burned into her imagination that day. I remember my great-grandparents were very formal. He was kind. She always scared me. It was Edith Meserve who ran the household. Her mild-mannered husband did what she told him to do and otherwise stayed in his workroom.
My mother was cold and strict. I remember I was very sensitive about my looks. I felt I was fearfully ugly. My mother would say, "Well, you look nice and clean, dear." That was the largest crumb of praise I ever got.
Dorothy escaped into a world of art. One of her early drawings was of the mother she would never warm to. Growing up, Dorothy, or Dot as she was often called, read books about Lincoln in her father's library.
The women in Lincoln's early life deserted him. He buried his mother when he was 10. Then he lost his sister. Then his first love. He was left frightened and deeply depressed. Because I am doomed to feel more pain than most people, I'm intrigued that Lincoln felt this pain so profoundly.
Each summer, their family shared a country house with her mother's favorite brother. Dorothy adored her Uncle Wesley.
Father called him a wastrel and a gambler, but I always looked forward to seeing him. He was fun. I remember the day he put a gun in his mouth and killed himself in front of our home.
That day haunted Dorothy and hardened her mother.
Mother scared me, saying we might lose Father too. She told me how his father had deserted him as a boy, and if my behavior didn't improve, Father might do the same.
From then on, my grandmother suffered from a fear of being abandoned. She craved her father's companionship, his warmth and approval. She spent most of her time at his side. Over the years, they became a team.
We worked daily together on his great collection. I'm burning with a fever to write a Lincoln book, illustrated with Father's pictures.
Early on, she wrote about the darkness that surrounded Lincoln's engagement to Mary Todd.
In many ways, Mary was Lincoln's opposite. She was rich and well-educated. He was poor with less than a year of schooling. But Mary liked his mind. She liked that he stood 8 inches taller than the average man. and she liked his powerful animal vitality. They got engaged, but friends said Lincoln lost his nerve. When the engagement was abruptly canceled, he descended into a deep depression.
My grandmother suffered from her own dark moods, usually triggered by exhaustion.
I am in the depths. My face hurts when I try to force a smile. I can't help thinking that all this agony of mind I go through will bring me to a higher place when I find it. He looked directly into the darkness. Most people look away.
Dorothy learned from Lincoln. She realized that after being trapped in long periods of darkness, he taught himself to rejoin the world, to live again.
After nearly 2 years of self-doubt, Lincoln emerged from his depression and reconciled with Mary. Heavy rain beat against the windows as their small wedding ceremony took place. But Lincoln's doubts were over.
I think Dorothy's own search for love helped her understand how confused Lincoln had been. Her worst fears came true the day she told her father that she was being courted by a minister.
I've never seen him react so angrily. He said he never trusted a man of God and ordered me never to see him again. Within days, he had me on an ocean liner heading to Paris to study drawing at the Sorbonne. It was so confusing.
I found my grandmother's hastily arranged passport. She later wrote how devastated she was. It was the abandonment she'd always feared. But over time, Paris changed her. She said her experience in the art studios gave her a freedom she'd never felt before. I think that year of formal training taught her how to use a talent that had been burning inside her.
Today, I locked myself in my room and spent the afternoon standing in front of my mirror, stark naked, making a picture of myself. I tore it in half.
Here in the attic was that torn self-portrait, a portrait of a young artist who was just getting to know herself. When Dorothy returned home a year later, the minister was long gone. Soon after that, she fell for my future grandfather. As she sketched his portrait, she realized he was her exact opposite. She lived in her mind, he was an outdoorsman. But she loved that he was kind and gentle. He loved the twinkle in her eyes.
Phil is the darlingest, most thoughtful person. He asked me if I would marry him, and I said yes. Last night we told Mother and Father. Father was darling. Mother was awful, ranting that under no circumstances must there be an engagement. She told Phil that I fall for every man I meet. It was insulting.
Dorothy's future in-laws also objected. Phil was the son of a wealthy New Englander. The George E. Kuhnhart textile mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts had made his parents rich, but not content. Phil brought Dorothy to the family estate known as Harcourt. When the young couple announced their plans to marry and move to New Jersey, they were ordered to end the engagement. Phil's father never warmed to Dorothy.
He saw me as getting in the way of his son one day running his empire. I was in tears when I told Father. He said, "Ignore them all, just do it."
With her father's support, against the wishes of everyone else, Dorothy and Phil were married in 1925. They wanted a family and soon had 3 children, including Philip, my red-headed father.
Philip is tender-hearted. He is sympathetic with animals in trouble. He's also sympathetic with things that aren't alive. If there is only one handkerchief in the dirty clothes hamper, he takes it out, saying it's lonely.
I recognized my father in the tender boy she tried to capture in words. Dorothy wrote notes about all her children. It was research she would one day use. With the mill providing for her family, Dorothy was able to think about the Lincoln book she would one day write. She said life with her family helped focus her thoughts about Lincoln.
I came to Washington to collect research about Lincoln as a husband and a father.
Research came easy for her. Writing was much harder.
I must now write. It may be no good, but I have to try. I'm feeling like an awful fool.
My grandmother was soon distracted.
I've spent the last 2 days researching ideas for a children's book. I'm interested in how their minds work and what makes them laugh. I'm feeling very mixed up.
Then forces beyond her control swept in. The crash on Wall Street and the downward spiral of the Great Depression sent the Kuhnhart Mill into bankruptcy.
What a dagger money can come to hold over one.
My grandfather found himself looking for a job. Their world of privilege was gone.
I'm feeling desperate. I realize it's really up to me to make some money.
My grandfather never let her know how desperate he too was feeling. In the daily calendars he kept, he recorded how hard it was to find work. His only relief was to be in his garden. Years later, I remember him there. It was the place he went to forget his burdens. During the Depression, he accepted a low-level job with a textile company in New York City. He hated it. He realized he needed Dorothy to help support the family.
Dot, you are many-sided, and I am not. Search your mind carefully and decide whether you want to work on Lincoln or pursue your ideas of writing and drawing for children.
Dorothy realized she had no choice. Writing for children was her best chance to make some money.
I got up at 5 in the morning, gulped 2 cups of coffee, and made my way in the darkness to my desk.
Her process involved writing, drawing, cutting, and pasting. She was experimenting with new ways to talk to children.
Once there was an old man with a red beard.
Dorothy drew her own illustrations and hand-printed the text, rather than having it set in type.
I did the drawings using India ink and 5 watercolors, using my children's paint box.
Her first book, Junket is Nice, looked different and was unlike any book ever written for children. It was about an old man eating junket, a kind of pudding. As he ate from a large bowl, all the grown-ups in the world guessed what he was thinking about. The guesses grew more and more absurd. In the end, the mind of a little boy turned out to be much smarter than all the grown-ups in the world. The answer was simple. The old man was thinking about junket. His prize was to lick the bowl.
And the little boy on the tricycle gave the old man with a red beard and red slippers a ride home to his supper.
Junket is Nice was rejected by Scribner's. A senior editor wrote, "Your story has more originality than anything that has come into this office. But with all the colors, it would just be too expensive to produce." My grandmother did not give up. She took it to Harcourt Brace, where it was accepted with one condition, that she redo the drawings with black and just one color.
As I could not in a million years have made these illustrations a second time, I took a great chance and dropped the whole book into a full bathtub. The watercolors rose to the surface, but the India ink held fast. Luckily, the pages did not melt, and when ironed, were usable.
In one box was that swollen first book that went on to become an instant bestseller. When Junket is Nice was published, the New York Herald Tribune called it more imaginative than Alice in Wonderland.
I simply write for myself. What pleases me is likely to please the young.
Her books were about loss and love. They reassured children about their fears like loneliness, or being hurt or lost or afraid, feelings that she remembered as a child. But despite her success, the collection was never far from her mind.
My mind is struggling to be working with Father. I need to get back to Lincoln. Today, as chance would have it, I made a discovery which will allow me to do just that.
At a used bookstore, Dorothy discovered hundreds of old books. They were being sold by the retired caretaker of the Lincoln home in Springfield, Illinois.
It was a treasure trove. Some are the actual books Lincoln had held in his hands and read.
My grandmother bought all 600 volumes. Then she drove to Springfield to meet the woman who had owned them. It was Mary Edwards Brown.
Dear Father, I'm here in Springfield. I spent last evening with Mrs. Brown, who owned the books.
Mrs. Brown was the keeper of her family's collection of Lincoln artifacts and photographs.
My mother was Josie Riemann, Lincoln's niece.
She showed me a leather box that was filled with old pictures. The top photograph was Mary Lincoln.
I knew her when I was a girl. I helped take care of her the year she died.
The next photograph was the president himself. Mrs. Brown sold me her entire collection. Then she told me the family stories that went with each picture.
Lincoln said, "My mother was the daughter he never had."
Using an old directory, I mapped out Springfield as Lincoln had known it, listing the homes of his friends and the places he shopped and worked.
The children of Springfield took to Mr. Lincoln. He was almost motherly.
He knew every child in Springfield by name. He called them his tagabouts.
Dorothy tracked down those tagabouts, who were now Springfield's old-timers.
I spent today with Isaac Diller. He is the only person still living who had been photographed with Lincoln.
When I was a boy, I saw Mr. Lincoln and his boys being photographed in front of his house. I ran across the street to get a free picture with the Lincolns, but I turned my head at the last minute and I came out as a blur.
She called that short piece Isaac's Mistake.
Dear Phil, I hope what I am trying to do will prove worth all this long separation from you, my darling, who I love so much.
Dottie, dear, the children and I are fine, and we all miss you. We are getting ready for Christmas, and you will be home with us soon.
I feel so selfish being away from my family, but I am finding new pieces that fit into the picture of the huge puzzle I am putting together. I must write something good, for Father's sake. I am really working to dig out things. Today, the custodian of Lincoln's tomb said that because of my being Mr. Meserve's daughter, she wanted to make sure I met someone who could give me a first-hand account of Lincoln's final burial in 1901. Fleetwood Lindley was there the day Lincoln's coffin was dug out of the earth and moved into the Lincoln tomb. Mr. Lindley was the last person ever to look into the coffin and verify his identity.
Lincoln had been dead for 36 years when I looked at him that last time. His eyebrows were gone, but his hair and beard were perfectly preserved.
My family lives in anticipation that my magazine articles will one day be part of my Lincoln book. I have so much unusual research. It makes me feel as if I know him. He did not like being called Abe or Mr. Lincoln. He preferred just plain Lincoln. He said, "I am in height 6 feet 4 inches nearly, lean in flesh, weighing on average 180 pounds. Neighbors say he was slightly pigeon-toed with a slow step, his mind somewhere else. Living with him wasn't easy. He was detached and withdrawn. It drove his young wife wild. When Mary Lincoln lost her temper, which she often did, Lincoln would simply walk out the door. He disliked conflict. He blocked out his problems at home with his work. I worry that this house is so overloaded with dusty old books. I find that increasingly I cough when I work. It is becoming a problem.
When the beds became covered in books, my grandfather moved into the guest room. He said he didn't like Lincoln being in his bed.
I rarely leave the bedroom, which is choked with my research. Everything is damp. Our roof is leaking, and my books are all green with mold. As the children run in and out, I can't escape the unavoidable interruptions to my work, so I'm leaving in the morning for Springfield. Dear Father, I've settled into the Abraham Lincoln Hotel in Springfield. The deeper I get back into this Lincoln writing business, I realize how under all the polite smiles of the specialists, it is a cutthroat business. Everyone's scraping to dig up new facts and use them first. I've just begun writing bits and pieces about the Lincoln family that I will later weave together into my book. The only thing Lincoln shared with his oldest son was a dimple. Robert grew up humorless and bitter.
Dorothy wrote how Lincoln was hard on Robert. As a young father, he could be sarcastic and mean-spirited. It was a quality he disliked in himself. Over time, he learned to become a kinder man.
Lincoln and Mary called their second son golden-haired Eddie. He did not live long enough to be photographed. Today, Mrs. Brown told me about the time when he was sick with tuberculosis.
The night before Eddie died, Mr. Lincoln had the same dream that he had whenever something unusual was going to happen. It always had to do with water.
Lincoln acknowledged he had premonitions. He knew his dreams often came true.
The morning after that dream, Eddie Lincoln stopped breathing.
Those who remembered Lincoln that day recalled a man bowed in pain. He had spent so much of his time at work during Eddie's short life. Now it was too late.
When my grandmother returned from Springfield, she went straight to her books.
Dottie, I think I shall begin calling you Mrs. Lincoln.
I remember my grandfather was always outdoors. Dorothy claimed fresh air didn't agree with her. She would call out the window, "Come in." My grandfather would smile and say, "Come out." Throughout the 1930s, my grandfather was concerned that my grandmother was working too hard. She juggled being a wife, a mother, children's author, and historian. She was writing a novel about a blind man and a children's book about Lincoln. She jumped from project to project.
I've got so many ideas rolling around in my mind that I can't make myself get down to the writing. Phil is growing frustrated with me.
You always say nothing's ready and that it will be soon. Why don't you finish one idea? You have dozens started.
He reminded her of a poem she had written when she was 16.
I called it The Place of Never Finished Things.
He said her poem had become a metaphor for her life, that she worked on so many things at once, it would take at least 3 or 4 Dorothys to get through it.
All I want to do is cry. I'm feeling desperate, almost insane.
Money problems overshadowed everything. My grandfather's small salary, along with my grandmother's income from her articles and children's books, just wasn't enough to support their family. At the height of the Depression, Dorothy panicked when she realized she was pregnant again. My grandmother, who loved babies more than anything, secretly researched how she could induce a miscarriage. Her letters describe what she went through. It sounded more like one of her stories, but it was real.
I have just taken 10 grains of quinine and jump whenever I can. The quinine is making me very shaky and weak, and I have buzzing in my ears.
After a week, she collapsed. She told her husband, "We are successful."
I feel a little as though we killed a son or a daughter, but it had to be, and now we can move ahead with our fight to survive.
My grandmother was weak and troubled. She coughed so hard she broke 3 ribs. She suffered a complete physical and mental breakdown. Heavily sedated, she spent 6 weeks in a blurry daze.
I have lost track of time. I suppose it is due to the fact that they keep me sort of doped with morphine. It worries me. I am trying to get well.
Dorothy recuperated at her childhood home. Her father treated her as if she was a child again.
I have a strange feeling, a sort of unworthiness. There is no worse punishment than the disappointment of your parents.
For weeks, she was surrounded by her father's Lincoln collection. His neat, orderly workroom became a refuge. She felt a peacefulness there that she had not felt in a long time.
I realize the one thing that seems to matter in this world is love.
Within a year of losing Eddie, Mary Lincoln gave birth to their third son, Willie.
Neighbors said that Willie was an exact copy of his father. He was smart and kind and funny. He carried his head slightly towards his left shoulder, just as his father did. When their fourth son, Thomas, was born, Lincoln called him Tadpole because of his big head. Tad was hard to care for. Born with what appeared to be a cleft palate, his words were breathy and nasal, almost another language. When he tried to say Springfield, it came out Tingfield. Lincoln was a better father to his two young sons. He was determined not to repeat the distant relationship he had with Robert.
The birth of Edith, Dorothy's fourth child, inspired her to write the book that she became best known for.
Judy can pat the bunny. Now you pat the bunny. Judy can look in the mirror. Now you look in the mirror. Now you put your finger through Mummy's ring.
Pat the Bunny became one of the best-selling children's books of all time and helped open millions of little eyes to the joy of reading. It's hard to believe that it was this small pink book that rescued our family from the grips of the Great Depression. Dorothy's next book was the same size as Pat the Bunny. It had a telephone inside, so children could actually talk to the characters in the book. The telephone book was another instant success.
Simon & Schuster has asked me to write a miniature library of tiny animal books. I'm really enjoying myself.
It was the most fulfilling time of Dorothy's life. She was successful and making money. And at age 42, she was pregnant again. But in hindsight, Dorothy came to believe that she had missed the opportunity of her life. As she was writing for children, her father had written a new book on the photographs of Lincoln. Instead of working with her, his co-author was Carl Sandburg, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Lincoln biographer. My grandmother was proud of her father, but also hurt. Sandburg tried to smooth over her feelings of jealousy.
Dear Dorothy, your father has spoken to me about your Lincoln research. I shall be glad to share with you anything I have learned.
Carl Sandburg spent a week at Dorothy's home studying her notes. He told her that she had uncovered many personal details about Lincoln that must be published. He was amused by a suitcase filled with her notes about Lincoln and animals.
Goats. Lincoln had a habit of talking to animals at length, as if they could understand him. Twice he was overheard talking to a large billy goat. Cats. They are his favorite animal. He used a gold spoon to feed a cat named Tabby at the White House dinner table. Rats. Lincoln could smell dead rats in the walls of the White House.
Sandburg read all of Dorothy's manuscripts. Each was unfinished, either because she had turned to another project or because she felt it just wasn't good enough.
He said, "It's nobody's goddamn business what you put in your first draft or your second or your 10th. That's a very comforting thought. He told me stop procrastinating and write a Lincoln book."
It was exactly what she needed to hear. Dorothy returned to the book she started researching years earlier about Lincoln as a father. Now she would tell his story through the eyes of his youngest son, Tad.
I began searching through the collection, hoping to find pictures of Tad around the time when Lincoln was elected president. I came upon a photograph of a dog. Beneath the picture were the words, "President Lincoln's dog." The year of Lincoln's presidential election, his dog Fido was skittish as strangers invaded Springfield for political rallies. As Lincoln stood outside his front door wearing a white suit, Fido cowered inside behind a couch, the only place he felt safe. Mary Lincoln, wearing a bonnet, peered out the window. This is the closest the Lincolns were ever photographed together. They never posed for the camera as a couple. It was Mary who decided Fido would be left behind when the Lincolns moved to Washington. It broke Tad's heart. He was just 52, but new whiskers made Lincoln look older. His mood was dark when he arrived in Washington. The country was breaking apart over the issue of slavery. A month after Lincoln took office, war broke out. The war consumed most of Lincoln's waking hours. He worked 16 hours every day. He submerged himself in hard thinking, even when he ate. He felt everyone's pain.
Dorothy wrote how everyone argued. Loyalties were strained, families divided.
When Mary Lincoln's 4 brothers joined the Confederate Army, Lincoln became their sworn enemy.
He suffered alone. She said his greatest relief came from seeing his 2 sons play in the White House.
Parents rarely admit that they have a favorite child. Willie was the son Lincoln loved most. But a year after coming to Washington, typhoid fever stole him away. Today I went to the tomb where Willie's small body was placed. From then on, Tad was his father's closest companion. Tad had his father's loving heart. One person called it the heart of a woman. I believe this little love story is the key to get me inside Lincoln's heart, too. Lincoln called his tongue-tied son his tricksy boy. The White House staff called him a spoiled brat. He lived in his father's blind spot. Tad broke into cabinet meetings, turned the garden hose on Secretary Stanton, and let his pet goat sleep on his bed.
Dorothy told her father, "I want to do Tad's story well, as much for you as for myself."
I feel it is such a wonderful subject, so right for these times. I wish it were done now.
But once again, Dorothy's personal life and work clashed. She suffered a miscarriage. Knowing that this was her last chance to have another child, she sunk into a deep depression. With the loss of her pregnancy, her Tad book was miscarried too.
We don't warn children enough that life is hard.
After that loss, Dorothy became obsessed with the subject of death.
Lincoln kept a photograph of a starved Union prisoner to remind himself of the horror of war. He had a morbid fascination with death. I do too.
During her recovery, she read and reread her grandfather's graphic war diaries.
I saw a bullet strike one of the men in the head, scattering his brains in all directions.
My grandmother said she needed to know the grim details of what death looked like, sounded like, smelled like.
I saw men wounded, and while they were lying groaning on the ground, I saw them killed.
People used to be exposed to death. Now we are more distant from it, so we fear it. The only death we see is the squirrel run over by a car.
It was the brutal carnage at Gettysburg that Dorothy chose to write about next.
For 3 days, Gettysburg was shrouded in a cloud of death. The casualties were staggering. 51,000 killed or wounded before the Confederate Army retreated. The air was poisoned with the stench of festering corpses puffing up in the hot sun. Townspeople gagged as they picked wildflowers from the hallowed battleground to memorialize what had taken place. It was a matter of health as well as honor that a cemetery be created right there.
Dorothy wrote about how Lincoln had something special to say when the Gettysburg Cemetery was dedicated in November. But he feared he might fail. His mind was elsewhere.
On the Wednesday morning Lincoln was to travel to Gettysburg, Tad woke up with a high fever. 4 months had gone by since the battle, but when Lincoln arrived, there was still the lingering smell of dead horses. One local widow had 17 carcasses rotting beside her house. An enormous crowd gathered on the grounds of the new cemetery. As he stood up to deliver the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln said he felt dizzy. He didn't know it, but he was fighting back a fever. In less than 3 minutes, his remarks were over. When he sat down, there was utter silence. The crowd had expected more. A reporter asked, "Is that all?" The president nodded. Lincoln thought his speech was a failure. He complained of a severe headache. He had contracted a mild case of smallpox, but news had come that Tad's fever had broken. That was all that mattered.
As my grandmother juggled her two worlds, my father's world was changing.
I got married and began having children. That's when I realized that the only way to break my mother away from her work was with babies.
I need to be around children. Lincoln did too.
My grandmother spent as much time as she could with each of her grandchildren, but we all realized it was Lincoln who got most of her attention.
1864 was an election year. Lincoln was running for a second term, but he was worn out. Visitors said the president looked gaunt. He'd lost 20 pounds. He also looked dirty. He wore the same clothes and often didn't brush his hair. He suffered from chronic constipation, complained his hands and feet were always cold, and said, "I have a strong impression that I shall not live to see the end."
We still have my grandmother's roll-top desk. Inside the cabinet, she kept her Lincoln treasures.
Lincoln's election to a second term gave him a sense of renewed strength, the power he needed for his greatest achievement. A year earlier, he had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Now he pushed the 13th Amendment through Congress. It abolished slavery forever.
Knowing that the end of the war was near, Lincoln sat for a photograph. It is the only portrait of him that reveals a hint of a smile.
When Grant's troops captured the city of Richmond, Lincoln's face beamed. He said, "Thank God I have lived to see this."
Lincoln said, "Let us not mind the meteors. Let us keep our eyes on the stars."
John F. Kennedy was sworn in 100 years after Lincoln. I was at his inauguration alone. Father was too weak to make the trip, but he wanted to send the new president a Lincoln photograph. His hands were trembly as he wrote an inscription on the back, "To John F. Kennedy with admiration." He asked me to mail it. I told him I would, then I forgot.
When my great-grandfather turned 96, he celebrated a new partnership. That day, my grandmother and my father promised him they would take care of the collection.
I told Father that Philip was going to help me finally write a book about Lincoln. In his frail voice, he said, "Nothing could please me more."
My great-great-grandfather's last diary entry was dated April 14th. He wrote, "Around midnight I was wakened. I was instructed to let no man pass unchallenged." With such orders came the news of President Lincoln's assassination.
Father never spoke about what happened to my grandfather after the war. Yesterday, for an hour, I questioned him about it. He finally told me the story.
After the war, my father raised our family, but the war had done something to his mind. He rejected his lifelong plan to be a dentist, and instead, he became a minister, a rigid fundamentalist. He abandoned our family and headed out west to spread the gospel. He told us that God would provide for us. Well, God didn't provide.
Father said he never trusted any man of God after his father deserted his family. I finally understood why he had broken up my courtship with a minister. He confessed how much he had suffered, how he had to drop out of school and hold many jobs to pay his mother's bills. Years later, he finally decided to try to heal the wounds caused by the desertion.
For 30 years, there was no communication. Then, my great-grandfather proposed they work on a project together.
I wrote my father and suggested that we work together on his war diary. I said that if he would turn it into a manuscript, I would look for photographs to illustrate his words.
His estranged father wrote back that he liked the idea, and the two reunited.
That's how the collection began. It was Frederick Meserve's early suffering, caused by his father's desertion, that drove him to collect. He collected to heal his wounds, and he kept this pain a secret until the end of his life. A secret stored in the back of an attic.
Each generation keeps secrets. I think most parents hide their pain from their children. We don't want them to see our weaknesses. In May 1962, Father was lying motionless on his bed. I put my mouth right up to his ear and shouted, "This is Dorothy. I love you." A little faraway voice answered, "Dear Dorothy." Then he was gone.
Within a month, she was told that her husband was dying too, of kidney failure. His doctor told her death would come quickly, that there was no hope.
When I got home from the doctor's office, I found Phil in his big chair. He gave me a heavenly smile and said, "I've missed you, Dottie, darling." It broke me up into little pieces.
Dottie, I'm afraid you won't have me much longer. I'm losing contact with the world.
When he died, none of her children saw her cry.
I have regrets about all the things that I had failed to do for him. I blame myself endlessly.
In January 1963, for the first time in her life, Dorothy was alone. She was 62 years old and sank into a deep depression.
The hours go by so slowly.
During that time, my father was raising his own family and working long hours as an editor of Life magazine. But he squeezed in time to be with her.
I have all these ideas about the collection, but I can't make myself do anything about them.
She began to tame her sadness with alcohol and pills, long before my father saw what was happening.
She took codeine for her constant cough. When I accused her of taking too much, she tried to make light of it, as if she were writing for children.
My hand just went over there and picked the pills up and put them in my mouth. I watched the hand do it.
I knew that hard work on Lincoln was the only way to break her loneliness. I pleaded with her to work on our Lincoln book, but she refused. Then, on November 22nd, everything changed.
During the entire weekend after President Kennedy was assassinated, I watched the frightful reenactment of the awful event that took place 98 years before.
The casket is now lying on the catafalque that was originally built and occupied by another assassinated president, President Abraham Lincoln, in the year 1865.
Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I feel absolutely dreadful that I did not send off to President Kennedy a portrait of Lincoln that my father asked me to send. Here it is, for your brave son, John. He reminds me so much of Lincoln's little boy, Tad.
Kennedy's assassination jolted my grandmother back to life. Her grief gave way to a new sense of purpose, working alongside my father.
Together we began work on the story of the first president ever to be assassinated.
John Wilkes Booth claimed to have been at Lincoln's second inauguration. So I carefully looked for him in the several exposures that were made. One shows Lincoln seated in his chair. In another, he is standing. A third image did not show Lincoln at all, because when the negative was being developed, a technician's fingerprint accidentally blotted him out. But what this third print did show was something that no other photograph did. The president's future assassin. Booth wisely concluded the moment was not right that day. Escape would be unthinkable.
John Wilkes Booth would get his chance just 5 weeks later.
On the last morning of his life, Lincoln said to Mary, "We must both be more cheerful in the future. Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have both been very miserable." Later that afternoon, he experienced one of his swift mood changes. He had had a dream, the same dream about water that he'd had before Eddie died.
To write about the assassination, my grandmother had to make it graphic in her own visual way.
At Ford's Theater that night, the tired president sat in a rocking chair in a balcony box. Mary sat at his side.
My grandmother worked with photographs and scissors and paste, just the way she'd made her children's books. She had to see Booth's view of Lincoln.
John Wilkes Booth quietly approached the presidential box. No one had noticed that earlier, Booth had drilled a peephole through the door.
She cut out a picture of his Derringer, tilted Lincoln's profile to look down, and measured the distance to show the assassin's close range.
His pistol held just one handmade bullet.
Dorothy made an important discovery. She uncovered a photograph that was taken of the bed where Lincoln lay unconscious for 9 hours before he stopped breathing.
This faded photograph was taken just a few minutes after Lincoln's body was removed, the pillow still soaked in his blood. People remembered the exact moment that they heard of his death. When 12-year-old Tad was told, he shrieked like a wounded deer.
My grandmother wrote how Booth's photograph was circulated during a massive manhunt. She discovered one with the words, "Do recognize him somewhere and kill him." After 12 days, soldiers tracked him down and shot him dead.
Booth's co-conspirators were rounded up. Each was forced to wear a canvas hood day and night.
When Dorothy requested to examine one, she was told that the headbags were restricted, still kept classified by the government.
I argued that as time passed, the Lincoln assassination could simply not be imagined by a new generation unless the relics were made public.
Dorothy became the first historian to be shown the hoods. She had to be physically restrained when she tried to put one on her head.
4 of the conspirators were sentenced to be hanged, including Mary Surratt, who ran the boarding house where the assassination was plotted. It was unbearably hot the day of the execution. As the 4 were led to the gallows, each could see their pine coffin and freshly dug grave. Nooses were adjusted, legs were bound, hanging hoods were pulled over their heads. When the general in charge clapped his hands twice, beams were knocked away, and the 4 bodies dropped in unison.
My grandmother wrote how Mary Lincoln refused to leave her bed. The men who carried the dead president to his funeral were ordered to take off their shoes before passing her bedroom door.
A funeral train would carry Lincoln home to be buried in Springfield. Willie's small coffin was placed at his father's side. The 12-day journey was an outpouring of grief the world had never before seen. 30 million Americans watched the train pass by. 1 million gazed upon his face. In city after city, there was the muffled roll of drum, the hypnotic, endless beat that rubbed people's nerves raw. Thousands made the pilgrimage to Lincoln's home. The crowd marched alongside Lincoln's coffin to Oak Ridge Cemetery. The children who were there that day remembered the sight of their parents crying for the rest of their lives. That afternoon, laughter could be heard around Springfield. First a little, then more. It was just not possible people were beginning to live again, already. But it was right. It was what Lincoln had meant when he said after the death of his 3-year-old son, "We must live."
My grandmother wrote until her wrist gave out.
Dear Philip, if I had more time, I might cut and rewrite this. But this last stretch of working 29 hours straight has killed me, as this heavy wad of paper will kill you.
They called it 20 days, the time from Lincoln's assassination until he was finally laid to rest in Springfield. My father edited and illustrated her words with photographs from the collection. It was the book she'd always dreamed of, the one she feared she might never write. She said how good it made her feel to see the crowds at the window of Scribner's bookstore. 20 days was dedicated to her father.
Dearest Philip, you wrote me that great things are going to come and that you want me at your side. I carry that letter with me. I want you to begin taking over the collection.
My grandmother never wrote another word about Lincoln. She was diagnosed with terminal lung disease. Her doctor said it was triggered by years of inhaling dust and mold in her fortress of old books.
I am a much happier person on the inside than I appear on the outside. My death may not be far away. Lincoln came to accept death. In his many dark thoughts, he was learning how to die. He shared his wisdom with me.
When she finally stopped breathing, there was no fear, no pain. It was something she'd never considered in a life filled with dread. It was peaceful. My father surrounded himself with my grandmother's library and began to organize the collection. He said it needed to be in a public institution. As he continued to write about Lincoln, his workroom was filled with the same books, the same smell. Over time, he developed the same cough. In the years that followed, my brother Philip and I worked with our father on Lincoln projects. It was a productive time. We were writing books and curating exhibits. We produced a Lincoln documentary, and we made plans to preserve the collection. But in the midst of it all, my father began having a difficult time breathing. It was the same lung disease his mother had. All his life, my father joked with his children about death. I think it was his way of making it less scary for us. Ever since I was a child, not a day passed that I did not dread his death. It was my grandmother's dread. It was why Lincoln kept Tad so close to him. I guess it's the price we pay for love.
These are unpublished manuscripts, and they consist of many children's books that she did and were not published, and trials and errors. And here's one over here, Peter, called the Cracker Animal Book. Read your book and eat it too.
He showed me the books without using his oxygen tank, at times struggling to breathe.
These are all first editions of the book, Pat the Bunny. And this is the prototype. The result has been almost 10 million copies.
At the end, he said, "Maybe you can use this in a documentary someday." Then, as if to an audience, he said,
"And that's all, folks."
My mother was with him the night he stopped breathing. Just before he died, he told her how much he was going to miss her. We buried my father next to his parents. Coming back here years later, I have all kinds of different feelings circling around me. What Lincoln called the mystic chords of memory. I realized that I never planned to dedicate so much of my life to Lincoln. It just happened. I felt I owed it to my father, just as he felt he owed it to his mother, and just how she felt she owed it to her father. Each of us walking in the footsteps of others. For as long as I can remember, this wonderful, mysterious national treasure has been my family's glorious burden. Glorious because we have been able to live with Lincoln, to learn about life from him. But it's also a burden that has taken its toll on each generation of our family. We must live, Lincoln said, live in the present, not the past. Since I was a little boy, I've been taught to hold on. For me, it's time to let go.